Welcome.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say, first of all, that I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm very excited to be, firstly, a part of MBPU TIS, and also to be taking part in this process of creating an evidence base, which is really ultimately an evidence base for all the people who are recipients of funding from the Department of Health for this programme. It is something that will be public as well, so hopefully it will benefit other people working in this area as well. So what is this evidence base for TIS? Firstly, well, it does many things. And I'd say, first of all, the two key things that it does is it brings together existing evidence, but it's also about helping to create and showcase new evidence that you guys are going to be producing as you go through the programme and through the process of helping people to move on to that quit journey. It's also going to be available through Health InfoNet. I'm not going to say any more about that because I think you'll get a glimpse of it later on. Is that right, Kathy? Yes? So you'll be able to see how it's going to look. But I think it's something that's going to be really important and really key to all of us working together. So why do we need it? Why do we need this evidence base? Well, there are some good reasons, and some of those relate to the aims of the programme as it stands now. And that's firstly, and again, these are things you've heard already. It's just about reinforcing the message that the activities that you undertake, we're very keen that those are going to be evidence-based. We're also keen that they're going to be locally relevant, and this evidence base is one way of helping you to achieve those aims. And it also links into the measurement of outcomes. But what I want to do is come to that one a little bit later and start just by focusing on these first two particular aims and important processes. So if we're going to talk about basing activities on evidence, then we're talking obviously about evidence-based practice. And there are many definitions out there. You can look and you can find them, but ultimately they come back to one thing. And that is that applying evidence to make sure that you're using the best possible practice is about looking at research evidence, but also using your professional expertise to interpret that research evidence, and also thinking about it in the context of your consumers, the people you're working with, your community, and their choices and what their needs are. So what I'd say is, whilst we often think about evidence as being something that's out there, that's research-based, that's maybe in journal articles or reports that have been commissioned by government departments, for example, evidence is a lot more than that. That's just one part of the puzzle. So yes, research evidence really matters, and there are two kinds of research evidence from my viewpoint. One is what we'd call the global evidence, the global research evidence, which is the stuff that's out there in those papers and articles. But there's also research evidence that's local. So it's that information that you gather yourselves, perhaps when you audit your programs, or you do evaluation and monitoring of the activities that you're undertaking. But evidence, as I've already said, is also about your professional experience. It's about the knowledge that you bring with you from the training that you've had and your experience working in particular forums and particular contexts. It's also about taking into account the values and preferences of the population you're working with. So that might come from community consultation that you participate in. It might also come from observations that you've made whilst engaging with people in previous practice. But it's very much as well about the local context and what that tells you and what those sorts of needs are. So evidence is many things, and it's by bringing all those things together that you can have a locally relevant service. And we hope that the evidence base is going to be one way of helping you to achieve bringing all those things together. So in part, what we're doing is about knowledge brokerage. It's about taking that research evidence that exists, that evidence out there, and providing you links and information around that. It's giving you insight into that evidence, helping to interpret it in part. It's also going to be about giving you links and providing you resources that are going to help you on your way as you plan and carry out your activities and evaluate and monitor what you're doing. Really importantly, though, it's about currency. So one of the things that we're going to undertake to actually update that evidence base. So it's not static. It's not just a set of journal articles that have been interpreted, but we're going to continually look at what's happening in this space and update that information so it's always current. But more importantly, it's about something that hopefully we're going to create together. So it's going to be about developing networks and linkages between all the people out there working in this particular space and helping you to create the evidence that's going to really grow this evidence base, if you like. So going back to what I said earlier, which I think Helen mentioned this morning, evidence-based practice, we need people to be applying the evidence. We want you to look at the information that we're going to be able to provide through the evidence base and use it in the process of planning your activities, in planning your program, and then also as you're going through and implementing in that sort of process of monitoring and evaluating what you're doing and then revising as you go through and planning and so on as the cycle goes in terms of that continuous improvement. So that's one really important role. And what I'd say around that is there's a whole wealth of evidence out there, but there's also huge gaps. So there are some areas of activities where we know that there's some good, strong evidence. And to give you an example of that, it's actually something that Tom Calmer mentioned this morning, workplace smoke-free policies. There's quite a lot of evidence out there that shows that not only does that reduce people's exposure to secondhand smoke, it can actually also increase people to take that step to have a quit attempt, to think about their own smoking. It can also promote people to think about what they're doing at home and in the car. Should they, reducing that smoking, which is going to reduce the amount of secondhand smoke, not just to themselves and to the workplace, but also to their families. And there's a whole range of evidence that links into that. And a lot of that global evidence, it's international. There's some mainstream work. There's work with other Indigenous populations in Canada and New Zealand. But there's also evidence that comes from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups as well, that this is something that can work and be effective. So some good, strong evidence there. There are other places where the evidence is much weaker in terms of a link to changing people's behaviours. One example that I wanted to give, because I know a lot of people are using this, is around social media and social networking. Hugely important when you're working with a young population. It's becoming more and more the place to go to, the tool to use. What's interesting, though, is if you look at the evidence that's out there, it's not so strong in terms of the impact it has on people's behaviours. There's a lot of sort of descriptive work that will talk about what people do, how they use it, and particularly that's in terms of using it as a tool to communicate, rather than its strength, which is really about developing networks and helping people develop peer support. There's also some work around analytics, so people actually looking to see what kind of posts are being made and how often people post and whether they do post or not and so on. But again, very descriptive. There is a recent study that suggests that networking might enhance people to make that step towards quit and to actually go through the process. But I think this is an area where it's early days and there is some mainstream international evidence, but we really need more. Okay, so there are definitely some areas where we can say, look, we know you're doing some work here, let's really help develop that evidence base and let's share that so we can look at the effectiveness of these kinds of things. I think the other thing I'd like to sort of emphasize while I'm on this point is that it's very easy to say that, oh, there's this activity and there's no evidence, so we should stop doing it. I think we really need to remember that no evidence is not the same as evidence that something doesn't work. Yeah, so I think there are lots of things that we think probably will have an impact, and I think social media is one of those, and social networking. We just don't have the evidence yet, but that's what we need to be working towards. So, why do we need an evidence base? As I already said, it's because we want you to be developing evidence-based activities, and we want you to do those, obviously, within your local context. But it's also really because of measurement of outcomes. It matters because what I've just said is this is about creating an evidence base and working together to create an evidence base. So, not only should you be using this outside information to help you plan, implement, and so on. But when you've done your monitoring, we need that fed back. We need to find out what's working. Yeah, so this really is about co-creation. So this evidence base, which will be on a portal on Health Infonet, it's not mine, doesn't belong to me, doesn't belong to MBPU TIS. It belongs to all of us. It's something that's a shared space. That's the way I see it, and it's very much about your contribution. It's going to be hugely important. And it really is then about creating the evidence by looking at practice as it goes from what we'd call emerging practice, where perhaps there's very little evidence, there's an indicator that this might be a good step forward, this might be a good set of activities, there may be some theory underpinning, sort of moving through to something that's starting to show some local evidence, so some promising practice to actually becoming something that is then able to be part of the mainstream global evidence that we have of what really works. So, what would I say around why we need this evidence base? It's because it's going to be a shared resource that's going to be driven by your needs. And this is something that we want to pick up in the later session at 2 o'clock. It's really finding out what it is that you need. Okay, we've made a start on this, but I really want to know that we're doing the right thing, find out where the gaps are, address those kinds of things. And we really need you to be sharing your best practice with us and to be sharing any resources that you might have and any stuff that you're using already that you think might be effective. We need to start looking at those and start building up that evidence base so that it can be something that we can all share. Thank you.